It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about appreciative inquiry. It's, of course, my favorite subject, and I also love telling the story about how it all got started, because it's a wonderful story. And so I'm going to just jump right in and tell you about Ken and David and their partnership in really getting this off the ground. At the conference that we had, the TAOS Institute had last year in Sarasota, there was a dialogue between the two of them on stage, and I took copious notes. So I'm going to read. I hope I'm correct. I'm correct in what I'm saying. But one of the things that Ken said right away in the speech was that watching David's work was like watching his own words in action. Ken's words in action. It gave me a new sense of being in the world and started a new chapter in my life. And that was very, I smiled when I heard that. And later on, he said the thing that is probably present with some of you in this room. He said, we carry multiple voices. There's always the voice of contradiction. So I have doubts about AI. I have the same feeling about my own work. I'm afraid that AI will become a technology that will freeze and move toward banality, perhaps even be used to manipulate. I worry about this. I have to say right away that I have the same concerns that Ken does, and that's why I was thrilled to be asked to talk here today, because I don't think that appreciative inquiry is a thing. I think it's a theory and a philosophy. And what we know as the 4D model, you know why it's called 4Ds? I'm stopping 1 minute and tell you this story. Dawn starts to laugh. Do you all know that Dawn Dole is David Cooper Ryder's sister? And and Dawn, she always chuckles because I'm always telling this story in front of her. But David and our colleague Ada Jo Mann were working in Zimbabwe. And we had long descriptions of what the process was like. First you do this, then you do this. And the Africans were totally confused by all this English language, in front of them. And so Ada Jo said, we got to get this down, David. Let's go. And so she came up with discover, dream, design, and deliver. Later became destiny, if some of you are familiar with this. Now, then she said to me, that's because it's David, Dawn, Debbie, and Daryl, the 4 Cooper Ryder children. So that's the 4D, that's the origin of the 4Ds. I want you to know that. So, how did I get into it? Well, in 1985, David was still in school, working on his PhD with Dr. Suresh Srivastava, who was his. He always gives Suresh lots of credit. He was a very, very good match for them. And he came to a conference that the National Training Laboratory was doing. Any of you know NTL? Have any of you heard that? NTL is the organization in the United States. It was started by Kurt Lewin, who had escaped from Nazi Germany and came to the U.S. and found racism. And he asked himself the question, why do human beings treat each other that way? And he got a large grant, part of it from the U.S. Navy, which I always thought was interesting, and began to experiment by putting people from 2 different races, and nowadays it's very multiple, of course, all over, in the same room and watching to see what would happen. And that became known as the T group, and on that was based the whole field of organization development. And out of organization development came appreciative inquiry. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a trip around this, because I think it addresses the issues that Ken named. Is this for real? Does it work? Why does it work? How does it work? So David and I met over a presentation I was doing at the conference on some work I'd been doing in Kenya. I'm a globetrotter. Denmark is my 76th country. And I had been working with these women for a long time using NTL, organization development type methodologies, teaching it to them so they could take it into the villages. And it was a big shift that USAID was making from us going over and telling people what to do, and I was really excited to be a part of that. And so I'd made a film about it, and I was showing it at this conference, and David showed up, and there were like only 7 people in the room because most OD people in those days wanted corporate work, and they weren't much interested in what was going on in the not-for-profits, but he was. And at the end, he stood up. I remember it so vividly. He stood up in the back of the room, and he said to me, "I just have one question, Jane." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Isn't that arrogant for us to go into Africa and tell people what to do?" And I said, "David, the point of the project is to pass on the skills to people who can then go into the villages." And I couldn't agree with you more. That's the shift that has to happen. And he said, "Would you go across the hall with me and listen to a presentation that John Carter is making?" And I knew John. And I said, "Sure." And it was the first time I heard of Appreciative Inquiry. John had been using it in Canada with a very large accounting firm, TAOS Ross, that wanted to do a retreat with 500 people doing team building. And John had been experimenting with Appreciative Inquiry. David went home and called me the next day and said, "I have just Xeroxed Ken Gergen's book for you," because it was out of print. This is, I'm going to get the title wrong, Ken, Transformation, on the Transformation of Social Knowledge. It's back in print now, yes, I discovered that. So I'm going to retire my, my slides up there? Great. And David sent me the book, right? We got that far. What happened after that was he called and he said, I really want to focus on global social change organizations, and I want to play around with what I'm studying and writing about and seeing how that works. And that was the beginning of another wonderful journey we made together, where he put together a conference. He had 5 of his colleagues that were also interested in Appreciative Inquiry do big studies of 5 global social development organizations, and we had a conference in '89 at Case Western, which I think was the first large conference around Appreciative Inquiry. I may be wrong about that, but I think it was. And from that point on, we were able to get a large grant from USAID to do something called the Global Excellence in Management Project. And we were able to take Appreciative Inquiry into dozens, literally dozens of countries around the world. So that's the origin of the process and how it developed. Because I mentioned that the 4D model came out of work that they were doing in Zimbabwe. And a lot of the other processes came out. Now, people say to me all the time, you know, it's just making nice, you're avoiding the negative, et cetera, et cetera. How many of you have those kinds of questions about AI? Yeah, it's very legitimate, isn't it, to ask those questions. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, let's see if I can do this. This is the origin of the field. And we started with tailored scientific management. Some of you, I'm sure, know that. Working largely in organizations like Ford Motor Company that had long-link technologies, and people were like cogs in the machinery, and so the outsider came in and looked around and said, "This is what you're doing wrong, and here's how you fix it." The Lewin work led to organizational development and the behavioral sciences coming into play, and the consultants go in and say, "Let me go around and talk to everybody. I'm going to gather up the information. I'll come back to you with what I find, and then we'll decide what's going to happen next." And David came along and said, "Everybody in the organization needs to sit down in this room together and have a conversation." And that's literally the shift that's happened. The process is the same in terms of being a what you do with AI when you go in. But that's not the only thing you do with it, because it is a philosophy and not. Did I do that already? I'm going backwards, thank you. Okay, so the theory of AI. Basic theory is the constructionist theory, and this is the, for lay people, this is when we talk about it. We socially construct our reality. We create our world in relationship with each other and through the conversations we have. We create what we imagine, and we make our path by walking. I like that one. The underlying real strength of appreciative inquiry are these principles, which some of you probably know. The constructionist principle, of course, being that we create the world by the conversations that we have in it. The simultaneity principle, change starts with the first question we ask. And if change starts with the first question, do you want it to be changed toward what you don't want or changed toward what you do want? And that is a choice we can make. The poetic principle is all about stories. The first part of appreciative inquiry practice is to tell each other a story. The first question is always, tell me a story about a wonderful experience you had in X or Y or Z, whatever we're looking at. And you can take stories and make meaning of them. So it's like poetry. It's like good poetry. The anticipatory principle, we're going to get what we look for again. You know, what we anticipate will happen is very likely to happen. And finally, the positive principle. If you're going to look for something, why don't you look for what you want rather than what you don't want? This is our question. We have begun to talk a lot, too, about wholeness as an overarching principle. If you, and this answers some of the questions you have about the either-orness of AI. The wholeness says, in every situation, there are how many of us in this room? 150? We'll probably have 130 different ideas about what went on, all right? That we really, we interpret what happens through our language and through our our ways of socially constructing things. So what happens is that each of us might make something quite different of the same event. And so the wholeness means that, in the way that we're using it in AI these days, is that what happens is just what happens, and the meaning gets made by the people that start to talk about what's happening. She was saying okay, so I know I'm doing good. I like that. I learn from her every time we're together. This is a classic. On the left-hand side is Kurt Lewin's classic action research model. What's the problem? What caused it? What possible solutions are there, and how are we going to treat it? It's the medical model. Something wrong around here, how can we fix it? The right-hand side is exactly the same sort of circle, but the focus is different. Instead of looking for what's wrong, let's say, okay, even if things are pretty terrible around here, there's got to be some things that went well. Let's find those and see what we were doing right. And the second thing is then, let's see if we did it right these 2 or 3 times, what might be? How might we actually make it better and more of it as we go forward? Out of all the possibilities, it might be, what do we want to do, what should be, and finally, let's decide what will be, what are our next steps. What happens in appreciative inquiry is that you go right back around the cycle. People say, what about evaluation? I call it valuation, and we go right back to question 1. How's it going around here? What's the best thing that's happened since we last met? You know, you go back to asking, where are the strengths, what's going well, how do we get more of it? Why is that important? It's important, as you well know, because the world is going so fast that by the time we look back and figure out what's wrong and try to figure out how to fix it, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, it's just past time when most of it's going to do good. So, just about enough said. This is for you to see that we even have someone now figuring out how to use AI in Six Sigma and Lean. For those of you who are OD professionals, those are models that a lot of the very large corporations like to use as a way of dealing with all kinds of things in the organization. And as you can see from that list, the appreciative inquiry can be used in coaching, we use it in leadership training, we use it in strategic planning. It's very powerful in strategic planning. What's different about it? Choicefully and purposefully positive, intentionally focused on what we want, chooses which voice to privilege, focused on dialogue, story, and narrative, transforms the system's inner dialogue, highly participative, radically democratic. All voices in the room we talk about. Involves the whole system and stimulates vision and creativity. Peter Drucker said the best way to predict the future is to create it. So I just want to take 1 minute more and say to you that if you get interested in this, there is the AI Commons is full of stories about it. Some of the more amazing ones lately have been Kofi Annan. One of the last things he did before he left the UN was to call together 500 of the top CEOs around the world from major corporations, and David came in and did an appreciative process with them. And it was very powerful, and there's a video on that you can see. We had an admiral in the Navy that put one together for the Navy. We had the yellow truck company that turned itself around from going bankrupt to being very profitable. Story after story after story. You almost have to sometime, just suspend your disbelief to think that things could turn around that fast. It's pretty amazing. So as we go through the rest of this time together, if any of you have questions or want to chat about any of this, I'd love to do so. And thank you for the time to talk about this. Okay, give you my